especially since he is here by himself. But the idea is to let him start making those decisions on what he wants to do, when he wants to do it. Where previously, anytime he did anything, it was because somebody asked for it.
Even with vastly improved conditions, Keiko continued to demonstrate his frustration from living in an artificial environment. He expressed his stress in Mexico by gnawing the concrete pool, damaging his teeth, and it continued in Oregon on his favorite rock. A decision was made to cover it in order to discourage the behavior and to protect the teeth of the ocean's greatest predator. An orca's sharp, conical-shaped teeth make feeding on large prey possible, but Keiko primarily eats fish which orcas swallow whole, so his damaged teeth should not be a problem in the wild. When he arrived in Oregon, Keiko was 1,000 pounds underweight, but soon doubled what he was eating in Mexico. His waistline increased by 3 feet. He gained nearly 2,000 pounds and grew 8 inches longer. But he still had to be taught to catch live fish as a milestone for his release, and in order to survive in the wild. Accustomed to only dead fish, at first he treated the live meal like a toy. Surrounded by walls, Keiko had never been observed using echolocation in captivity, and to a wild killer whale, it's a fundamental skill.
The whale's hearing spectrum is many times ours. Their sensitivity is incredible. They see with sound, so when they're finding food, they use their echolocation. They make sounds, they get echoes, and they can turn that into a mental three-dimensional image somehow.
You know, when you go into different places around the world and you look at what orcas are doing and understand that they've sort of figured out how to live in the particular niche that they happen to have found, it's really interesting looking at the differences.
As gray whales migrate up the coast through Monterey, California, a pod of transient orcas show why they're called wolves of the sea. They hunt in packs to isolate, then overpower a gray whale calf. It's a predictable hunt, with as many as a third of the calves taken by orcas. 20 to 30 whales may work together and share the bounty.
Sharing seems to be really important in these groups. It seems to be part of the way that the whales live together to avoid competition.
Certainly they food share when it comes to feeding on larger animals, but that's probably more a facet of the fact that these things that they're feeding on, like whales, are so big and there's not many of them. In terms of, if they kill one, then everybody has to feed on it.
A female, the best hunters, will bring up a fish, and others from her matriline will come over and share that prey item. What's kind of surprising for the residents, they will share even a salmon that's perhaps only 5-10 pounds. They will share that, even though any whale in the group could easily swallow it. It has given us a new appreciation and insight into the workings of their society. That said, even though their dietary preference is culturally maintained and driven, they don't seem to be really adaptable in the short term. It might take a while before they can start focusing on alternative species.
Killer whales are real traditionalists. They only do what mom did. They eat when mom eats, and they socialize with the whales that mom socialized with. They really don't like to branch out.
So if you have a habitat change and that particular prey is not there anymore, then it's difficult for the orca to adapt.
Within decades, and for a variety of reasons, orcas throughout the world may be at the crossroads of adaptation or extinction as their prey diminishes, something the resident whales of the Pacific Northwest now face. It's a growing issue for the future, but is similar to the question of whether Keiko would be able to adapt to hunting live fish in the wild. Without another whale to teach him, Keiko initially seemed confused about the shift in his diet, until finally either hunger or common sense kicked in, and he began to catch a few live fish. In the wild, that wouldn't be enough. Using ultrasound to measure Keiko's fat layer or blubber, the staff identified where it would show if he weren't eating enough. In theory, by measuring his blubber so easily in the wild from an extended pole, Scientists could know if and when they would have to intervene. They did know that Keiko would have to be in better shape than he had ever been, so even his 30 different toys were designed with a purpose. Filled with water, a 200-pound ball became Keiko's workout. When he first arrived, Keiko could barely hold his breath for 3.5 minutes. He soon progressed to almost 18, normal for a wild killer whale. But Keiko was still far from a wild whale, which was vividly seen when at night he gathered his toys around him to sleep. An array of cameras and hydrophones captured Keiko's movements and sounds. Taking advantage of this opportunity, scientists carefully analyzed his vocalizations, trying to match them with specific behaviors, hoping to take a step toward understanding killer whale communication. Keiko, however, had not communicated with another orca in more than 20 years.
I was studying a pair of whales called Orca and Corky. They would begin conversations with certain sounds and end conversations with certain sounds. And I realized that studying communication between those two whales in captivity would be like studying communication between two people in a prison. That there was no way that I was going to actually learn what they were saying and the real context of their lives.
I'll tell you the main thing about Corky, and she's a survivor. She has been in captivity for 38 years, about 43 years old, which is incredibly old for a captive orca. Most of them die within 10 years. She still uses the calls of the A5 pod, and she is swimming around the tank, and in a concrete tank, the sounds that they make reverberate off the walls of the tank. They're constantly in an acoustic fuzz. I think it's an incredibly stressful environment simply because of that.
And how is your research here at Orca Lab different?
Well, when I was working in captivity and understood that if one wanted really to learn about them, you needed to go into the wild and study them there at a distance. And that's where we got into developing remote hydrophone systems that enable us to hear whales that we can't see. We have a network of hydrophones, covers about 50 square kilometers of the area around us, and we have speakers all over the place. We're listening to all of them all of the time, 24/7, 365. But we're normally listening to a space, and there are many voices in that space. In a sort of general sense, we understand when the whales are doing certain things. We understand when they're chasing fish, for example, because we're hearing echolocation. We understand when they're resting, because they make these really sort of low-energy calls. But we don't know who the voices belong to. So I think a really fascinating area to get into is the question of who as individuals are we listening to. And if we can understand who's speaking, maybe ultimately we might begin to understand what is being said.
I wanted to take all that I had learned in captivity and apply it to wild whales. And so I contacted a brilliant scientist in Canada, Dr. Mike Bigg, and I asked him, do you know what family of whales Orca and Corky came from? Which sounds like an extraordinary request, but he at the time was photographing each dorsal fin and saddle, learning to tell them apart, collecting all the pictures from the capture, and there was a bunch of pictures that showed this whale we now call A23 with little baby Corky just before she was taken from her mom. So I had no boat experience. I threw everything into a pickup truck, and we pumped up the Zodiac in Alert Bay, and we went out there, and I stopped and I put the hydrophones down, put on the headsets, and it was her family calling. And for the first time, I heard these sounds in their natural environment just rolling on and echoing. And my first feeling was enormous guilt that it was me that was there, not Corky. But that's how I found them.
One promising factor in Keiko's finding his family was that orca calls can be heard 10 miles away. There was hope for a dialect match among the North Atlantic orcas, where Keiko would be reintroduced, 100 miles from where he was captured. To prepare for his move, a bay pen was constructed in a pristine Icelandic bay. Finally, the day arrived to return Keiko to the home he barely knew. This had been Keiko's unexpected journey to freedom that millions of children demanded, but that no one knew exactly how to accomplish. Jean-Michel had watched Keiko's transformation for over 2.5 years and had been witness to his devoted fans.
Good luck!
Even the U.S. Air Force had agreed to rent a C-17 cargo plane and crew for the trip, announcing it was in the best interest of the nation to fly Keiko home. He was covered in ointment for the flight to protect his skin from drying. After 15 anxious hours out of his element, Keiko was at last returned to the cold ocean waters of his birth. It was seen as the first step to restoring what had been taken away when he was captured. Keiko would first have to acclimate inside the confines of the bay pen. Months later, his world expanded to the enclosed bay, where for the first time, he ruled in relative freedom. It was Keiko's first chance at a small piece of the wild. Not since he was 2 years old had he experienced the sights, and especially the complexity of sounds, of a natural ocean environment. It had been 23 years, half his expected lifetime, since Keiko had even seen the bottom of the sea. Keiko's world was gradually expanding, and for the next step, a satellite tag was attached to his rare flopped dorsal fin in order to follow him at sea. Its attachment was no more painful than piercing an ear, but the tag and Keiko would have to wait another season following complications to be tested at sea. Finally, in the summer of 2000, sea trials began. Everything from then on was up to Keiko. The difficult promise to give him the choice of freedom had been kept. Then at last, Keiko was within feet of wild killer whales. He seemed enthusiastic at first, but then experienced what might have been shyness or fear and turned back. Later encounters looked aggressive, and Keiko continued to seek the shelter of the boat.
Right there, Chad. Right there. Of course it's speed, Michael.
Over 3 summers, Keiko continued to approach passing whales, spending more time with them, possibly learning their ways.